Hey everybody, welcome back to the Jamsy Online YouTube channel. One of our neighbors blew a head gasket on their lawnmower, and I figured it would make a good little video to hold the audience over while we wait on some parts to come in on the 4.2 liter Jag engine from last week's video. As you can probably tell from all the baked on oil, this head has been pretty hot, and what many people don't realize is that if the head has been hot enough to warp and blow a gasket, that likely means that the valve seats and valves have warped a bit and likely are no longer sealing perfectly. In this case, the intake valve pulls pretty poor vacuum even for a used head, so while the head is here, let's pop the springs off so that we can take out the valves and get a closer look. On a head as big as this, the easiest method to remove the springs is with the spring compressor adapter in the TCM25 seat and guide machine, but you could use a drill press at home. For the life of me, I could not find a magnetic pickup tool in the shop, so I was using a pick to pop the keepers out of place, and it took an embarrassing number of attempts. Nevertheless, we finally got the springs off, and again, you can see how hot the head has been by the oil baked on around the exhaust valve. The exhaust valve didn't show any abnormal signs of wear, but after removing the intake valve, it's already obvious where the problem is. Notice that the intake seat is shiny all the way around, with the exception of the dark area close to the exhaust valve. This dark area is where the seat has been too hot and the valve is no longer sealing there. Again, as such, the valve face is somewhat of a mirror image of the seat, and we see the same dark area on the face. I went ahead and put my cleaning guy to work glass beading the cylinder head to get the ports clean and clean the grease out of the cooling fins, while I went to work grinding both of the valves. I put some color on the valve face to help the visual, but it's still a bit tough to see. As the grinding wheel first contacts the face of the valve, you can see that the face of the valve is not grinding evenly, which we expected. I decided to pause here to show the dull area where the valve has not fully cleaned up yet, but with just a bit more grinding, the face will be trued up. Aside from being able to see that the grinder is touched all the way around, you can also hear when it has cleaned up as the sound becomes more smooth from the grinding stone. Of course, I ground the exhaust valve too, which took much less to clean up, but when I went to turn the camera off, I realized that I had never actually hit record. I trued up the valve tips as well, and now these valves should be almost as good as new, which brings us back to the head and the valve seats. With the head fixtured up on the 34.5 seat machine, I went ahead and set up a 3-angle cutting insert with a 40 thousandths wide 45 degree seat. This is going to be a pretty light cut, I'm assuming, so I set the spindle to around 400 RPM and slowly feed the cutter into the seat. All 3 angles cleaned up almost immediately on one side, but it took cutting a bit deeper to fully clean up the seat, with the last area to clean up being that area near the exhaust seat, as we expected after teardown. At this point, we have a fresh intake seat that will be aligned and concentric to the valve guide and ready to seal. I gave it a little slow-mo valve bounce, but with this size of valve, it's a bit like trying to bounce a feather. For the exhaust seat, I'm running a 55 thousandths wide, 45 degree seat cutter, and I went ahead and sped up the spindle to around 600 RPM after starting my cut. Despite the fact that the exhaust valve did pull decent vacuum for a used head before teardown, it was a bit off as well, and again took just a bit more cutting to clean up all the way around the seat. I should also note that no, the valve guides were not perfect, but we're already doing more work on this head than it's worth, but we just wanted to help the neighbor out. After cutting the valve seats, the exhaust valve pulls good vacuum even without a valve spring, and it leaks down similarly to the way it did before teardown. The intake seat also pulls good vacuum, which is a great improvement over the test prior to teardown. Now at this point, we can get back to the original concern, which was the blown head gasket. We can use a precision straight edge and a 3 thousandths feeler gauge to check if the surface is straight. On one side, the feeler gauge cannot slip under the straight edge, indicating no warpage. However, when we get to the opposite side of the head, as well as the side of the head where the exhaust port exits, there are pretty wide areas where the gauge slides freely beneath the straight edge, indicating a warp of at least 3 thousandths of an inch. As such, we're going to be resurfacing the head, and since it's aluminum, I'm going to install one of our PCD cutting inserts into our cutting head here on the boring and surfacing mill. After making a few checks, including the good old shake and saying that ain't going anywhere, we'll turn the machine on and traverse the cylinder head beneath the cutter. The PCD cutter is insanely quiet on light cuts, so I have my hand held out to feel for the chips as I slowly feed the cutter until I see that we're cutting. At that point, I zero the Z-axis on the DRO, lower the cutter to make a 1/1000ths cut, and start the table traverse motor and speed up to the max feed rate. Here in slow motion, you can barely see the light chips that almost look like confetti as the cutter comes across the head on each revolution. On a 6-cylinder John Deere head, there's enough time while the machine makes its pass that you can head across the shop and work on something else while the machine runs. Turns out on a head this size, by the time you get to the other side of the shop and pick up something to work on, the cutter has already ran across the entire head and it's time to head back over to make another cut. With the dial indicator, we can measure the low spots that haven't shined up, and from the looks of it, we need at least another thou and a half to clean up. Knowing that, we'll feed the cutter for a 1.5 thousandths cut on this pass, which is going to bring us to a total of 2.5 thousandths off the head. And here we can see that on that pass, the head gasket surface almost cleaned up completely with the exception of one dull area still showing a bit of a warp, which I'm pretty sure will clean up with another 1 thou cut. I'll take a gamble that this is going to be our last cut and slow the traverse speed to about half of max speed. This light of a cut at a pretty slow feed rate should leave us with a mirror-like finish. I have to say the PCD cutter still impresses me every single time that I use it. We used to simply use a CBN cutter for cast iron as well as aluminum, but it always left a draggy finish on the aluminum, so I'm glad we decided to upgrade to the PCD. With the head gasket surface nice and flat again, the machine work is finished, and all that's left to do is to give the head and parts a thorough wash in the spray cabinet before we can move on to assembly. Obviously, we don't want any of those chips from machining, and especially the glass beads, to be left as contaminants in the head, so a thorough rinse and blow dry is one of the most critical parts in our process. With assembly lubricant on the valve stems, the valves are installed into the head before flipping it back over to install the valve springs. The intake valve gets a brand new valve stem seal also, while the exhaust valve goes without on these engines. Luckily for me, reinstalling the valve keepers went a lot easier than the removal did. With the spring retainer in place atop the valve spring, we compress the spring and the keepers fall into the keeper grooves with nearly no additional assistance. The one thing to note is that when compressing valve springs, you want to avoid squishing the brand new valve stem seal with the retainer. And as always, we give it one last final check, and we see essentially perfect vacuum on both the intake and exhaust valves. The very slight leak down on the exhaust side shows the difference between a seal and no seal, as without a valve stem seal, very slight amounts of vacuum can slip past the valve stem out the valve guide. If you enjoyed, be sure to like and subscribe, and stay tuned as I have a few very fun videos coming in the next few weeks. Thanks again, and we'll see you in the next one.